What do you fear? That's the persistent question that has carried us through the 4 weeks of Advent, the so far 10 days of Christmas, 6 Sundays, and now a 7th sermon. And over this course of this series, we've taken fear seriously. We've named it honestly. We've talked about fear as being biological, as the way our bodies naturally react to threats, either real threats or even just perceived threats, those instinctive responses, the fight or flight or freeze or fawn, or as I learned this week, there's actually another one called flop. Who knew? Learning things every single week. We also talked about fear as cultural, the stories that we observe and absorb, that our culture, that sometimes we're not really critical of the cultural waters we're swimming in. We just sort of accept the assumptions they're built on about who's dangerous, about who's safe. Stories that teach us who the other is, who we're supposed to fear, however other is defined in any given moment, whether it's by race or religion or nationality or ideology or way of life. We've talked about fear as political, as the way that power maintains itself by keeping people afraid. It's a great way to fundraise and to get people to show up at polls. Fear becomes a tool that consolidates power and it narrows imagination. It discourages solidarity by convincing us that safety can only be found through strength and exclusion and dominance. And we've talked about fear as spiritual, that quiet, persistent anxiety that we are not enough, that our lives don't add up to much, that what we do ultimately won't matter, convincing us that hope is naive, that faith is futile. And yet this season we've also insisted on hope. Not on optimism, not on hope as denial of realities, but simply as a way of living hope-filled lives. We've learned to look inward to name our deepest hopes and desires. We've learned to look outward and notice the quiet, holy ways that God is already at work. And hope, as I've emphasized over and over again, is not something that we feel or wait to feel. It's something that we practice. It's a way that we live, one faithful step at a time. And that's where we find ourselves today as we observe this Epiphany Sunday. And we shift the question away from what do we fear to what are we following? For the Magi, the answer to that question is both simple and complex. They are following a star. When Matthew tells us that the Magi came from the east, he wasn't being vague or poetic in any way to his first readers in that first century. This phrase carried real historical and political weight. These were not kings. They were scholars, astrologers, priests, interpreters of dreams. At that stage would have been seasoned diplomats. They would have been formed by the ancient wisdom traditions that long predated Rome itself. Their roots lay in the old Persian world, a sophisticated civilization. It was conquered by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE, but it was never fully erased. Greek power had spread east, but the Persian learning endured. This is one of those cases where I had never really learned much about this part of the world. I had been trained in Western civilization, and have you ever just known you needed a paragraph for something, and then you clicked into a body of knowledge you didn't know yet, and you go down the rabbit hole? All that to say is after the service, I've got a 3-hour lecture on the Persian and Parthian empires, if anybody would be interested. I would have been done with the sermon days earlier if I had not gone down this rabbit hole. But I want to share this with all of you. The Persian Empire conquered by the Greeks. 100 years later, a nomadic tribe of people in what's now northeastern Iran, the Parni tribe, the Parthian people, overthrew the Greeks. And they created an empire that stretched from the Euphrates River to the borders of India, and it endured for nearly 500 years. The last 250 years before Christ and the next 250 years after. So by the time of Jesus, The Parthians were Rome's greatest rival, and Israel was right on that edge as that border went back and forth. The Parthians, who had conquered what was left over of the Greeks and the Persians, they honored these ancient Persian traditions, including the Magi class. The Parthians valued cosmology, interpretation of dreams, signs in the heaven. And by this stage in history, the Magi had become kingmakers. They played a crucial role in selecting the Parthian kings. They served on a council that ensured royal accountability. In other words, these Magi weren't some starry-eyed mystics wandering in from nowhere. They were educated outsiders. They were savvy. They were worldly. They were wise. And they were shaped by a very different imagination about how the world works. Perhaps we should not be surprised that it was they who recognized something genuinely new was breaking into history. They followed the star, yes, but they would have gone along well-known trade routes. Through diplomatic channels they understood, into political territory they knew how to navigate. They weren't naive, they weren't recklessly wandering. It was attentive and practiced discernment. They had seen a sign, and they were open to wonder, and they trusted that something significant was unfolding, something that beckoned them forward across these borders and cultures and empires. And when they knelt before the child, and when they offered their gifts, they weren't pretending that somehow the world had changed. They knew Herod was still Herod, that the empire was still violent, that power still behaved badly. In fact, coming from the halls of power in their own lands, they would have understood those realities all too well. But something else had become clear in this amazing moment, that the so-called realities of the world are not its deepest truths. Sometimes the light of joy does break through darkness, and sometimes love does lead us forward. The ancient wisdom, the political savvy that is likely would have been held by these Magi conclude their part of the story. Having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. You see, just because the Magi understood the mechanisms of power doesn't mean that they were bound to participate in them. They simply refused to be a part of the violent schemes of Herod. They took another road home. And this phrase, home by another way, home by another road, it has long functioned as a powerful spiritual metaphor. It shows up again and again in sermons and in books, even in popular music. James Taylor has a song, Home by Another Way, that recounts this whole story. Simon and Garfunkel, Pete Seeger, U2 have all used the phrase to talk about what happens when you encounter something so profound that it changes our direction. And I don't know if that truly describes the experience of these Magi. Their new direction, we're told, came to a dream, and we're left to wonder how or even whether this encounter with the Christ child really changed them. But that phrase, home by another way, it has endured because it rings so true for so many of us. It names the experience of a quiet but decisive shift, this inner refusal to keep moving through life as we have before. For some, going home by another way means choosing integrity over expedience. Further, it means loosening their grip on fear-driven habits, withdrawal or cynicism or self-protection, and taking a risk on trust instead. Going home by another way can mean reordering our priorities, changing how we speak about others, rethinking how we give our time and our energy and our resources. And sometimes another way is not about where we're going, but how we're going about it. Moving through the same world, but with a different posture, less anxious, less reactive, more attentive to wonder, more open to the possibility, God is still at work. This phrase has endured because it names the experience of realizing that once you've glimpsed love made flesh, you simply can't return to life as though nothing has changed. Home by another way means allowing love to lead us forward. I'm moved by the courage of the Magi and their resistance to Herod's manipulative schemes. As we saw in our message last week, when people decline to cooperate with oppressive power, those in control often respond with fury. In this case, the Magi's refusal to acquiesce to Herod led to murderous results. Joseph, Mary, Jesus had to flee to Egypt as refugees. In other words, we shouldn't be naive and understand that real hope isn't ethereal, it's not abstract, and an authentic spiritual life can't be compartmentalized from the cultural, the political realities. Choosing the way of love, choosing this other way, it means choosing a way that's not one of violence or coercion. Choosing the way of love means not choosing the way of self-interest that's detached from the plight of others. Choosing love is its own act of resistance, and it risks the consequences of those wielding power through other means. We need to remember that Jesus himself, following the way of love, followed it all the way to the cross. So choosing the way of love doesn't make fear disappear, and it doesn't make us safer, it doesn't guarantee success, but we choose the way of love because in the end, we believe it's the only way that endures. The fear may drive us one direction or another, but love is the only thing that can truly lead us. It refuses to let fear have the final word. It's love that allows us to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, because we're no longer governed by the need to protect ourselves at all costs. And love allows us and leads us to forgive, not because harm doesn't matter, but because we trust that resentment shouldn't define us. And love leads us to show up to serve, and to show up to give, and to risk solidarity, when fear would rather that we stay quiet and keep our distance. It's being led by love that allows us to protest injustice and work for change without becoming the very things that we are opposing. And love allows us to pray and to worship, not as an escape from the world, but as a way of truly loving it, rooting ourselves in hope rather than in despair. Choosing the way of love frees us from the exhausting work of living as though fear is the truest thing about our world. So the Magi didn't overthrow Herod, they didn't fix the system, they didn't prevent the violence that followed, but they knelt and they offered their gifts and they chose another way home. So as we stand here at the beginning of the new year, will we be driven by fear, or will we be led by love? To be sure, fear will always offer us a road that is familiar, that's well-worn, that's easy to find. But love offers us another way. It offers us a hopeful way, a way that endures even if it's less traveled by these days. So let us choose love. Let us walk in it. Let us allow love to lead us forward. I invite you now to pray with me. O God of light and love, you know the fears that we carry, the roads that feel familiar, and the ways that we're tempted to let fear decide our direction, the ways that we respond and react and live our days. And still you invite us to follow, to trust that your light is not dimmed, to trust that your love is strong enough to endure. So Lord, give us the courage to walk another way, the wisdom to recognize where you're already at work, the grace. Give us the grace to live as people shaped not by fear, but by the love made flesh in Jesus Christ. So may our lives bear witness to that love in the paths that we choose and the people that we serve, today and in the days to come. Amen.